This is the Check It Out podcast from the library. I'm Troy Swanson.
I'm Tish Hayes.
My name's Joe Malarkey.
And we are here with our special guest, Cheryl Bundy, faculty member in Comm and Literature. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. This podcast continues our conversations in preparation for our upcoming graphic novel symposium, which takes place September 18th and 19th this fall. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how we think in academics about graphic novels and comic books and things like that. So I would like to ask Cheryl just to get us started, maybe to help us, maybe we can define a little bit, what do we mean by graphic novel?
Okay, so this is a difficult thing to define in some ways. I mean, probably most people have seen the funny papers and seen comic strips and so on. Graphic novels are typically more book-length works that might tell extended stories. Sometimes the art is a little bit different from a typical comic strip. It might be more complicated or nuanced, more impressionistic sometimes. So reading them can be really pleasurable and fun because the works tend to seem just artistic in different ways from comic strips. It's hard to talk about. Anyone else care to add on to the definition?
Visual form with text that tells a story, linear story.
Okay,
right?
so is it more than a book-length comic strip?
Right. Or comic book.
Comic book.
I mean, so in my mind...
Let me just ask that, okay?
This is my mind, which is scary and going into Troy's mind. But, I think of the graphic novel more as a longer form comic book that tells a more complete story. Now, sometimes that's a collection of individual comic books. So I think of a comic book as the shorter monthly issued thing that you'd pick up at a comic shop or wherever, bookstore if they still exist, which is different than the daily comic strip that used to come out in the newspaper that would be, a 5-panel story that may continue day to day. But clearly they're all related, and some of those things are more complete than others, and there's people that would disagree with what I just said.
Sure.
And that's what's great about it, is that comics encompass a whole range of art and text combined, and sometimes those play out in short comic strips that are focused on superheroes and costumes and the supernatural, and then sometimes they're really literary, really complex works of art that focus on people's lives or experiences. So it's a huge range of stuff.
Yeah, and I think there's still some maybe they're looked down on in many circles, but for many years, I mean, going back probably from the 50s and 60s up to today, the form has been growing up and telling more complicated stories, and I feel like in the last couple decades, we've really seen this blossoming and coming into its own of graphic novels. And that's why we're doing our graphic novel symposium, because we feel like it's a form that is looked down on that we want to shine a spotlight on. So Cheryl, maybe you can tell us why you like graphic novels, or what kinds of graphic novels you like, and maybe take us into some of the stuff you use in classes and things like that.
Yeah, sure. It's not uncommon for anyone who's taken any of my classes for me to do a lot of work with what we would call visual literacy. So it's not uncommon, for example, in my classes for us to do a lot of photography work, or we'll do film work and so on. So we do graphic novel work as well. In my Comm 102, I've often used a pretty well-known work by Marjane Satrapi called Persepolis, which is about, it's a nonfiction book actually, it's a memoir. It's 2 books long, so it has like 2 volumes to it. It's a big text, but it's basically the story of the author growing up during the Islamic Revolution, and it's a super interesting story.
In Iran. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And she has an interesting heritage. Her story is fascinating. It's really a coming-of-age story, and we've sometimes used it in conjunction with reading a more familiar work like Jane Eyre. There are a lot of connections between the 2 stories, so it's a lot of fun to think about the stories and the way they work together. In my fiction writing class, we've often used graphic novels. One example would be Daniel Clo's Ghost World, which there is a film version of it that's hilarious, and it stars Scarlett Johansson, actually. It's a great film. Steve Buscemi is in it as well. And so we've used that text to talk about how story is maybe constructed in that form when you're working with visuals, visual art as well as text. And usually my students end up taking an existing short story and trying to actually create a graphic novel version of it. So that's actually a project in our
It's a great
class,
project.
and they love that project. It's hilarious and interesting, and we talk a lot about how do we do it. What roles does text play in a graphic novel, and what can you do with the images to help tell parts of the story?
Now, I've got a question. Do you find that flipping from, say, a traditional text like Jane Eyre, okay, with your students to a graphic novel text, do you find people have trouble with that?
It's real interesting, and it's not unlike the trouble they might have if I say we're going to watch a foreign film. We watch sometimes the film Amelie in my classes. There's another sort of obscure film I use. It's Danish. It's called The Five Obstructions. It's a Lars von Trier film. And so sometimes the students will balk at the idea of having to watch the film and read text at the same time.
With the subtitle.
Yeah.
Right.
And it just like anything else, it doesn't take very long for you to sort of get acquainted with how to do that, and soon it's not an issue at all, and you're able to process it. I think graphic novels are slightly different in that regard, and it might depend on the artist too. Some artists are not traditional in any way, and I'm thinking of, I can't remember the author of this particular book, but there's a book called Asterios Polyp, and it's a book about a professor. And what's interesting about the book is that there's almost like a jazz-like quality to the art. It's very impressionistic, and it's not even full color in lots of places, so certain characters will be assigned a certain palette, a certain style, and so they're, in addition to you just trying to get your mind around what is the story, there are these other layers that add to it as the colors interact with each other, because the characters are interacting with each other. It's gorgeous and it's amazing. So figuring out how to unpackage all of that is challenging, but I guess it's not unlike reading a novel and having to unpackage the imagery or the symbolism, allusions to other texts, and so on. All of that is really kind of connected, which is another reason I use these texts, so that students can see that regardless of the kind of text we use, even if we're just watching some video on YouTube or something from CNN or anywhere, there's a lot to unpackage and there's a lot to read, and we might use the same sorts of strategies across the different genres.
Your comment, it reminds me, we had talked a little bit earlier about Scott McCloud's book, and he has a book, Understanding Comics, I think that's right, and it's actually a graphic novel that demonstrates, how graphic novels work, and to me, he's really building an argument that graphic novels and comic books deserve their rightful place as their own form, because people often think of them as like a film or a cartoon that just happens to be laid out on paper, but when you talk about using different color palettes and different the way that they compartmentalize a page and have different framing of people and stories, I think he builds a compelling argument that it does something different in your mind than does a cartoon, than does prose, than does poetry.
Yeah, I think a great example of that is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, because the art that she does is, it's gorgeous, it's amazing. The story she's telling in text is also really interesting. It's a personal story. But what happens between the text and the images, there are sections that, what the text is telling you one thing, the image is telling you another thing, and you can't understand the story without looking at both of them. And I think that transforms, reading a cheesy comic strip, maybe, as fun as those are, it transforms it into literature or art or, this other thing that is pretty incredible. And I think, gives your brain just this, workout that you don't normally get from one or the other, text or visual arts.
Well, and something you're making me think of is that, Walt Disney didn't make those animated films for children. He made them for everybody. you know,
Right.
and they have like, you know, they sort of follow, because I mean I studied, you know, folk literature and you know, and then we watched a couple of them, and then watched how he translated the story in that. But we've sort of like delegated them to kids.
Right.
That's you know, for children to watch, okay, and then maybe we'll watch over their shoulder, you know, but we don't really appreciate that I think a lot of people don't appreciate that they're meant for everybody.
Yeah.
Right, that there are these things happening visually that unless you train your eye to see them, like you'll just miss them. Like you can gloss over so much that's happening on a screen or on a page if you're not really paying attention and thinking
Right.
about how to read those things.
This past fall, Tish and I worked in one of the lit classes, and some of the students. So it was they were reading a bunch of novels, and then the last group project they could pick any novel they wanted, and a group picked V for Vendetta, which is a graphic novel,
Right,
which
right.
was great. But I think it was a challenging shift for them to go from reading all of this prose
Right.
to this visual form, and we had to talk to them a little bit about how to read through and look at the images and understand what they're trying to communicate.
Yeah, and Alan Moore's a really complex artist. You know, it was definitely not maybe the best intro to graphic novels.
Yes.
You know, I think there are definitely like artists that are maybe a little bit easier to like jump into, and he is not one of those. So it was definitely right a challenge and interesting to see both what they got out of it and then what they were struggling with.
And so Cheryl, in your classes, how do you set up students when they pick up the first graphic novel that you teach?
You know, I'm trying to remember what I do. I know that I've used parts of that Scott McCloud book, Understanding Comics, as a way for us to think about it. But I think also sometimes we might just examine a text and try to look at some of the pieces that comprise it. So, you know, there might be text that's used solely as narration, you know, so there's a narrator speaking that text in the graphic novel. There might be text that is meant to be dialogue, that a character is speaking. So there are these different elements that are a part of storytelling, but they maybe play a different role in the text itself in a graphic novel. So that might be a way that we play with it. We might look at like a traditional comic strip and talk about maybe I'll give them a comic strip and then I'll remove one of the boxes and then we'll talk about, do you know what I
Filling it
mean?
in.
Like,
Yeah, right.
well, you know, and maybe it'll be the middle box, right? How do we get from A to B? And so part of it is thinking about the gaps between the little parts of the text and how we fill those gaps, which is a really important part of working with literature anyway. You know, interpreting literature and understanding it is so much about filling the gaps that are left by the author, the places where the text is not being completely explicit about what's going on. And that's true for graphic novels as well. So yeah, definitely I think we work in that way to try and understand how to read the material. And then we talk a lot about, well, what's it like, you know, after you've read a section of Ghost World or something like that. What's going on? What do you think about these characters? What are we learning? And it ends up being kind of the same conversation you'd have about any literary text, I mean, in large degree, which is part of the fun.
Right.
So-
Yeah, I can see that. Okay. Joe and Tish, any final thoughts? Okay, well, I want to thank Cheryl for coming in and spending the time talking. This is great.
Yeah, thanks
And,
for asking me.
Just as a further plug for our graphic novel symposium, Cheryl will be doing a lecture as part of this event on that Thursday, which is the 18th, in the afternoon. So come and listen to that. And thank you for your time, and thank you to our listeners.